The words landed across the breakfast table like a stone dropped into still water, and Lenora Leland felt every ripple move through her chest before she could stop them. "I think I stopped being lost here." Nathan Ralston said it quietly, the way a man says something he has been holding inside for longer than he knows, the way a confession escapes before the mind can catch it and stuff it back down where it belongs. He was looking at her over the rim of his tin coffee mug, those dark eyes steady and unblinking, his jaw still carrying 3 days of rough stubble, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe of morning light that spilled in through the kitchen window of her small homestead. He had not shaved. He had not dressed for anything formal. He was simply sitting there, elbows on the rough pine table, a half-eaten biscuit on the plate beside him, and he was looking at her like she was something he had spent his whole life walking toward without knowing it. Lenora felt the breath leave her lungs. She felt the terror follow immediately after, because she knew who Nathan Ralston was. She knew what the drifter carried with him, the dark past that clung to him like trail dust that never washed out, the secrets he had offered her in fragments and pieces over the weeks he had been working her land. She knew there were people looking for him. She knew there was a name attached to his history that made sheriffs go quiet and outlaws go pale. She knew that loving him, truly letting herself fall into those words he had just spoken, meant stepping into a trap she had not set but could not avoid. And she knew something else, something she had not told him yet, something that would change everything. Her name had been Lenora Leland for 29 years, and she had spent the last 3 of those years in Redstone Creek, Colorado, in the year 1884, trying to hold onto a piece of land that everyone in town believed she would eventually lose. She had come west under circumstances that felt now like the prologue to a story she had not understood she was living. She had arrived with a trunk, a deed, and a grief so large she could not yet see its edges. She had not arrived expecting Nathan Ralston. Nobody ever did. She set down her own mug and looked at him across that table, and the morning light was doing something unbearable to the angles of his face, softening the hard lines that years of hard living had carved into him, and she thought, not for the first time, that she was in serious trouble. "You should not have said that," she told him, her voice lower than she intended. He didn't flinch. "I know. Because things are not what they appear to be, Nathan. About me, about this land." His eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of a man who has learned that the ground can shift without warning, and that the only way to survive that is to keep your feet balanced and your mind open. "Tell me," he said. So she did, and everything between them began again, properly from the beginning, with the full weight of truth between them and nothing hidden. She had arrived in Redstone Creek in the spring of 1881, and the land deed she carried had belonged to her husband. His name had been Carver Leland. He had not been a good man. That was a simple summary for a complicated truth. The way the word storm is a simple summary for lightning and flooding and the kind of darkness that makes daylight feel like a memory. Carver had been charming in the beginning, the way certain men are charming, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes and a warmth that felt like standing close to a fire you cannot fully trust. He had courted her in Ohio, married her in Ohio, and then informed her 3 months into the marriage that they were going west. Not asked, informed. He had heard about land in Colorado Territory, about the cattle runs and the silver, and the possibility of becoming something bigger than what a man could become in the settled East. He had heard about Redstone Creek specifically, a growing town at the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and he had purchased a land deed through a contact in Denver, whose name Lenora would not learn until much later, under circumstances much darker than she could have imagined at the time. They had made the journey west in the summer of 1880. Lenora had been 26, and she had carried with her a hope that the distance might change him, that the open land might open something in him. She had been wrong about that, as young women who marry difficult men are often wrong about change, believing in it the way you believe in a sunrise that is simply not coming. Carver had been cruel in the particular way of men who know exactly how to stay just below the line of what other people will call unforgivable. He had not broken her bones. He had broken other things. He had eroded her slowly, systematically, the way water erodes stone. He had told her she was not capable of running the land alone. He had told her she was not capable of understanding money, or business, or the way the world worked. He had told her this so consistently, and with such confidence that she had begun, over time, to believe it, the way you begin to believe a story told to you often enough. Then Carver Leland had ridden out one evening in the fall of 1881 and not come home. They found him 3 days later at the base of Cutter's Pass, his horse grazing nearby, his body bearing the evidence of a fall. The sheriff, a man named Dolan who wore his authority the way some men wear a coat 2 sizes too large, had ruled it an accident. Lenora had stood at the graveside in her black dress and felt something she was not supposed to feel, something she would spend the following months trying to categorize as grief and failing at that assignment entirely. What she had felt was a complicated, terrible, shameful relief. And then she had felt the full weight of what she had inherited, not just the land, the debt, the hidden obligation. The secret that Carver had buried so deeply into the deed of that land that she had not found it until the first spring, when a man named Holt Greer had ridden up to her front porch on a coal-black horse and smiled at her with all the warmth of a January wind. Holt Greer was what the territory called a land agent, though the word agent implied a kind of honest brokerage that had nothing to do with what Greer actually did. Greer was the man who had sold Carver the deed in the first place, and he had done so with a clause buried in the fine print that Carver had either not read or not understood or not cared about, a clause that stated the land was purchased on a lien arrangement whereby, if certain annual payments were not made by a specific date each year, the land would revert to Greer's holding company by default. Carver had made the first payment before he died. He had made no arrangements for the second. Greer had come to inform Lenora in that calm, almost polite way of men who enjoy watching something crumble, that she had 6 months to either make the full payment, which was a sum she had no earthly means of producing, or vacate the property. Lenora had stood on that porch and looked at Holt Greer and understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that the trap Carver had walked them into was now her trap to escape alone. She had not vacated. She had planted her feet on that land, and she had learned everything she did not know, and she had worked it. She had hired a hand the following spring, a quiet older man named Theo who had bad knees and excellent judgment, and together they had managed the small cattle herd that Carver had assembled. She had sold enough cattle to make a partial payment, which Greer had accepted with the smug patience of a man who knows he is going to win eventually. She had kept the land another year, and another. By 1884 she was still standing, but Greer's patience was showing its teeth again. He had sent word that the payment coming due in September of that year would need to be the full remaining balance or the clause would be enacted. The sum was $420, and Lenora had $93 saved. Theo's knees had finally given out entirely in the spring of 1884, and he had gone to stay with his sister in Pueblo, and Lenora had been alone on the land for 2 months when Nathan Ralston had appeared at the edge of her property line on a gray horse with a bedroll and a rifle and not much else, asking if she had work. She had looked at him for a long moment. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with the kind of physical confidence that comes not from vanity, but from simply having used a body hard for a long time. He had dark hair that needed cutting and dark eyes that were watching her with a patience that felt almost animal, not threatening, but still, the way a wolf sits still. His face was all angles and weather, the kind of face that age and outdoor living carves into something harder and more interesting than whatever it started as. He wore a worn canvas duster and a hat with a creased brim, and his hands, she noticed, were the hands of a man who had worked but also fought, with the particular arrangement of old scars across the knuckles that told a story without words. She had needed help. Her situation was one of those desperate ones that quietly strips away your choices until the only ones left are the ones you would not have chosen otherwise. She had hired him. She had told herself it was purely practical. She had been lying to herself. His name was Nathan Ralston, and she did not know yet what that name carried. He had told her he was a drifter, which was true as far as it went. The way the surface of deep water is true, but tells you nothing about what lives below it. He had told her he was looking for work and a place to sleep that was not the open ground, which was also true. He had offered references from a rancher in New Mexico territory, a man named Alderman, and she had written to Alderman and received back a letter that said Nathan Ralston was the hardest worker he had employed in 20 years, and that he had let him go not for any fault, but because he had needed to let half his workforce go when the cattle market had dropped. She had taken him on for $30 a month plus board, which meant he slept in the small room off the barn that she had previously used for storage. The first 2 weeks, he was simply a hand. He was up before her each morning. He did the work that needed doing. He ate the meals she cooked with a sincere gratitude that was different from Carver's entitled expectation, and he did not bother her with conversation she did not want. The 3rd week, they had their first real conversation. It had started because of the fence line along the east pasture. She had gone out to check the progress of the repair work he was doing, and she had found him stopped, not resting, but standing very still, looking out across the valley below the property toward the mountains in the distance. The late afternoon light was doing that extraordinary thing it did in that country at that time of day, turning everything golden and rust-red and violet all at once, and the mountain stood against it like a proclamation. She had walked up beside him, and he had not startled, only acknowledged her presence without turning. "Something wrong with the fence?" she had asked. "No," he said. "I just needed a minute with that view." She had looked at it then, the view she saw every day and had stopped truly seeing, and she had looked at it through the awareness that someone else was seeing it for the first time, and it had hit her again, the strange, complicated beauty of this land she was fighting to keep. "Where are you from?" she asked. She had not asked before. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thoughtful. "Texas originally," he said. "Then a lot of places after that." "Why a lot of places?" He finally looked at her, and in the late light, the darkness of his eyes had that depth that she found alarming because she could not see the bottom of it. "Because I did something I am not proud of," he said carefully, "and then I kept moving, thinking that if I got far enough away from it, it would stop being true." It was an honest answer that told her almost nothing specific and everything essential. She recognized the architecture of a man carrying something heavy that he had not yet found a place to set down. She had not pushed him. She understood that particular kind of carried weight. They had walked back toward the house together, and she had made coffee, and they had sat on the porch in the cooling evening and talked about nothing consequential, about the cattle and the water supply and the condition of the south fence, and it had been the most comfortable she had felt in the company of another person in longer than she could accurately measure. Over the following weeks, the conversations deepened. Not rapidly, not in a rush. In the way that trust builds between careful people, incrementally, each small disclosure making the next one slightly easier, each shared silence making the next shared word slightly more possible. She learned that he was 32, that he had grown up on a small ranch in West Texas near the Pecos River, the son of a cattleman who had worked himself to an early death and a mother who had followed not long after, that he had 2 brothers, one of whom he still wrote to occasionally, and one of whom he did not speak of except to say, once, in a voice that closed the subject effectively, that they did not get along. He learned that she had been married, that she was a widow, that she was fighting to keep the land. He did not yet know about Holt Greer or the full weight of the debt, and she was not ready to tell him. It felt too much like asking for rescue, and she had spent 3 years becoming the kind of woman who did not ask for rescue. What she did not yet know about him was the thing that would come out not in the gentle, incremental way their other truths had come out, but all at once, violently, on a Tuesday afternoon in August when a man rode up the road to the homestead, and she watched Nathan Ralston's face do something she had never seen it do before. She was in the garden, pulling weeds from between the bean rows, when the rider came. She straightened up and shielded her eyes against the sun and looked at the man, who was lean and road-worn and had a deputy's badge pinned to his vest. He was probably 40, with a narrow, sun-weathered face and eyes that moved quickly and settled on everything without appearing to settle on anything. "Afternoon," he said, pulling up his horse. "I'm looking for a man named Nathan Ralston. Got word he might be working somewhere in this vicinity." Lenora felt the ground shift slightly under her feet. She said, "Who is asking?" "Deputy Marshal Tanner Briggs, out of the Santa Fe office," the man said, and produced a document from his coat that had the official look of federal authorization. "Nathan Ralston is a person of interest in connection with a robbery that took place in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882. She kept her face entirely still. She had learned to do this from Carver in one of the few useful lessons her marriage had provided. "There is no one here by that name," she said. Briggs looked at the property slowly, the barn, the smaller outbuilding, the corral where a gray horse stood. "That's a fine horse," he said pleasantly. "Similar description to one we have on record." "A lot of gray horses in Colorado," she said. There was a pause that stretched like wire pulled between two posts. "If you do come across a man of that description," Briggs said finally, tall, dark-haired, scar on his left hand, strong build, "it would be in your interest to send word to the marshal's office in Pueblo." He produced a card and held it out. She crossed the garden and took it without expression. Briggs touched his hat, smiled a smile that had nothing warm in it, and rode back down the road. Lenora stood with the card in her hand and her heart hammering against her ribs, and then she turned and walked directly to the barn, where Nathan was repairing a section of harness, and she stood in the barn doorway and said, "You had better tell me everything right now." He went still. His hand stopped moving on the leather straps. He looked up at her, and she saw it cross his face, not guilt exactly, but something like the exhausted recognition of a man who has been running from something and has just heard it catch up. He set the harness down. He told her. In the spring of 1882, Nathan Ralston had been riding with two other men, both of whom he had fallen in with the previous winter after his mother's death had left him rootless and grief-stripped and stupid with loneliness, which was not an excuse, he was careful to say, only an explanation. The two men were named Cord Mackey and Del Sutter, and they were, in the language of the territory, bad news, though Nathan had told himself at the time that they were simply rough men who knew how to survive, which was the story that certain people in certain desperate emotional states will tell themselves about bad company. Cord Mackey had robbed a bank in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory. Nathan had been present. He had held the horses outside. He had not gone into the bank. He had not drawn a weapon on anyone. He had not fired a shot. But he had been there, and he had known what was happening, and he had not stopped it, and a bank clerk inside had been hit over the head with a rifle butt by Del Sutter and had suffered a serious injury, though the man had survived. Nathan had split from Mackey and Sutter the same night. They had ridden east with the money. He had ridden north. He had spent the 2 years since moving, taking honest work when he could find it, sending what he could in an anonymous envelope to the bank in Cimarron, which he was aware was not justice and was not enough but was the only form of it available to him. He had not touched any of the proceeds. He had taken nothing, but he had been there. Lenora listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, the barn was very quiet, just the sound of the horse shifting in its stall and the distant sound of the wind moving across the hills. "Did you know they were going to rob the bank?" she asked. A pause. "Mackey told me the night before," he said. "I should have ridden away that night. I didn't." "Why not?" "Because I was afraid," he said, and the honesty of that, the simple, undefended admission, struck her somewhere she had not expected. Man who is only involved in a federal matter as a lookout and who immediately fled the scene and has since sent restitution, she said slowly, thinking out loud, is not the same as the men who committed the crime. The law may not agree with that distinction. The law is sometimes wrong about distinction, she said. She meant it as a practical statement, not a philosophical one, though it was perhaps both. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not going to turn me in. It was not a question. It was the quiet recognition of something already decided. I am not going to turn you in, she said, but you need to be more careful. And you need to tell me, are there others looking for you, not just Briggs? Cord Mackey, he said, and his voice shifted on that name in a way that made her stomach tight. Mackey thinks I know where some of the money is hidden. I don't, but he thinks I do. He has been looking for me on and off for 2 years. Is Mackey dangerous? Cord Mackey is the most dangerous man I have ever personally known, Nathan said without inflection. And I have personally known some dangerous men. She stood in the barn doorway and absorbed this. A federal deputy looking for him from one direction, an outlaw looking for him from another. Her land under threat from Holt Greer. $93 in the tin under her bedroom floorboard. September and its demands coming closer every morning. She was surrounded, she realized, on every side by traps she had not set. She looked at Nathan Ralston and said, I think we have a great deal to figure out together. The way his face changed at the word together, briefly, involuntarily, before he pulled it back to its usual careful stillness, was the first moment she allowed herself to understand that what was happening between them was not simply an employer and a hired hand navigating a difficult situation. It was something considerably more complicated and considerably more important. The days that followed were ones in which they built something together, not just practically but in every other sense. They worked side by side through the August heat, mending the north fence, rotating the small cattle herd, checking the water situation as the creek ran lower in the dry summer months. They talked through every problem with a directness that neither of them had experienced with another person, and the talking was a kind of relief for both of them. The way releasing pressure from a sealed vessel is relief, necessary and profound. She told him about Holt Greer, about the clause in the deed, about the $420 she did not have. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, his expression had hardened in a way she recognized as anger, not at her but on her behalf, and the distinction mattered to her more than she would have expected. Greer knew Carver wasn't going to read the fine print, Nathan said. Greer knew, she agreed. He has a history of this kind of arrangement. I have spoken to a woman in town, a widow named Mrs. Farley, whose husband bought land from Greer on similar terms and lost it within 2 years. Greer now owns that property. He is building a portfolio of land in this county through these hidden clauses. That is fraud, Nathan said flatly. It is structured carefully enough not to be, she said. The clause is in the deed. It was signed. Carver signed it, without understanding it, which is extremely difficult to prove now that Carver is dead. He looked at the fire in the hearth, the small flames reflecting in his dark eyes, and she watched him think. Do you have the deed? He asked. Yes. And do you know a lawyer in this territory you trust? She hesitated. There is a man in Pueblo, an attorney named Hargrove. He is known to be honest. I have not consulted him because I could not afford his fee. I have been saving my wage, Nathan said. 3 months at $30 is $90. That is mine to direct as I choose. She stared at him. I am not taking your savings. You are not taking anything. I am choosing to spend it on a legal consultation that benefits both of us, because I intend to keep working this land as long as you will have me, and I would prefer that it remain yours. The way he said it, plainly and without drama, was somehow more affecting than if he had said it with great emotion. It was the practicality of it that undid her, the matter-of-fact way he had included himself in her future. She opened her mouth and closed it again. That is, he said, watching her carefully, if you want me to stay. She thought about Deputy Marshal Briggs and his thin smile and his question about the gray horse. She thought about Cord Mackey, whom she had not met and already feared. She thought about Holt Greer in September. She thought about the $93 under the floorboard and the $420 she owed. She thought about the last 3 years of doing everything alone and the way her shoulders had begun to feel the permanent weight of it. She thought about the way Nathan Ralston had stood on the hilltop looking at the valley in the last light as if he was seeing something worth stopping for. "Yes," she said. "I want you to stay." He nodded, as though it was settled. As though they had made a practical agreement. And perhaps they had. But the thing that had passed between them in that moment was not practical in any way that she could adequately describe. And she thought, lying in her bed that night listening to the wind come down off the mountains, that she had not been this afraid of something she also wanted this much since the last time she had stood at the edge of a decision that would change her life entirely. The trip to Pueblo happened the following week. They rode together, which itself was an event in a territory where reputation traveled faster than telegrams and people observed everything and discussed it at length. Lenora knew that tongues in Red Stone Creek would move at the sight of her riding into Pueblo with her hired man, but she had decided somewhere in the previous 3 years that the opinions of people who had never tried to hold land alone as a woman in a hostile territory were opinions she could not afford to weight heavily. The attorney Hargrove was a compact, serious-faced man of about 50 who wore spectacles and had the organized, precise manner of someone who had spent decades thinking very carefully about language. He examined the deed with the attention of a surgeon examining a wound, asking precise questions, taking careful notes on a yellow pad. At the end of an hour, he looked up over his spectacles and said, "Mrs. Leland, this clause is aggressive, but it is not without legal vulnerability. The language here is ambiguous in a specific way that I believe a judge could interpret in your favor, particularly under Colorado territorial law, which has recently had rulings regarding unconscionable contract terms in property transactions." Lenora felt something loosen in her chest. "You believe we have grounds to challenge it?" "I believe we have grounds to file an injunction preventing any action by Greer until a hearing can be held," Hargrove said. "Whether the hearing ultimately goes in your favor depends on evidence and argument." "But the clock can be stopped." Nathan leaned forward. "What does the injunction require? A filing fee of $15 and an affidavit from Mrs. Leland regarding the circumstances of the original transaction, specifically any evidence that Greer misrepresented the terms to her late husband." "I have letters," Lenora said, "from before the purchase. Carver kept them in a box. I have never thrown them away." She paused. "One of the letters from Greer describes the property as having clean title with no encumbrances. That is directly contradicted by the clause." Hargrove's eyebrows rose. "That, Mrs. Leland, is potentially significant. That could constitute misrepresentation." They filed the injunction that afternoon. Hargrove took his initial fee of $30 for the filing and the first hour of work, and they rode back to Red Stone Creek in the long amber light of the late afternoon, and Lenora felt, for the first time in months, that the ground under her feet was slightly more solid than it had been. She was aware, the whole ride back, of Nathan beside her, his gray horse keeping easy pace with her bay, his profile steady against the mountain backdrop. She was aware of the way he sat a horse, loose and economical, the way of a man who had spent many years in the saddle. She was aware of the warmth of him at the distance of 3 feet, which should not have been noticeable but was. "Thank you," she said when they were close to home, when the homestead buildings were visible in the dip below the hill. "I didn't do much," he said. "You gave $90 and you came with me," she said. "You did not have to do either." He was quiet for a moment, then, "There is nowhere else I would rather have been today." She looked at him. He was looking ahead at the homestead, at the familiar outline of the land. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her then. "What is it?" she asked. "What is really happening with you? Not the legal situation, not Mackey. What is happening here?" She gestured between them without being entirely precise about it, because being precise about it felt like naming a thing that might vanish if you named it too directly. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I think you know what is happening," he said. "I think I know what I feel," she said carefully. "I want to know if it is mutual before I do something foolish with that knowledge." Something changed in his face, a softening that was not weakness but something that looked very much like courage. "It is entirely mutual," he said, "and I am not sure what to do with that either, given my situation. I am not in a position to make promises to anyone that I can keep with certainty." "I am not asking for promises," she said. "I have had a man who made promises he either could not or would not keep. I am not interested in promises. I am interested in honesty." "Then honestly," he said, "I have not felt at home anywhere in 2 years, not since Texas, not since I made the choices I made." He paused. "I feel at home on this land. And I feel something around you that I do not have a clean word for. And that frightens me considerably, because the last time I let myself feel that kind of thing I was not in a position to protect it, and I let it be destroyed by my own poor judgment." She thought about this. She thought about the careful, measured way he had just opened something in himself and put it on the table between them, the way he had put the deed on Hargrove's desk, honestly, for examination, for judgment, without pretending it was more solid than it was. "We are both frightened," she said. "I think that is probably all right." They were at the gate of the homestead by then, and they rode through it in silence. And when they unsaddled the horses and put them in the corral and stood in the yard in the last light, he reached out and touched her face, just briefly, with one of those scarred hands, just the tips of his fingers against her cheek, and she closed her eyes for a moment. And it was the smallest thing and the most significant thing that had happened to her in years. That night she wrote a long letter to her sister in Ohio, the first truly honest letter she had written in a very long time, and she described Nathan Ralston with a precision that surprised her as she wrote it, as though the act of putting him into words was clarifying something she had been too close to see. She sealed the letter and put it in her coat pocket to take to town, and did not sleep for a long time, lying in the dark listening to the sounds of the land, the wind, the cattle, the distant call of an owl, and the knowledge that Nathan was in the small room off the barn, also likely awake, carrying his own thoughts through the dark. The following weeks held a sweetness that she could not have predicted and was careful with, the way you are careful with something you are not sure the world will let you keep. They found a rhythm together that felt entirely natural and entirely new morning coffee before the work started, which was when they talked most easily, afternoons of physical labor that left them both quiet and tired in a good way, evenings on the porch where sometimes they talked and sometimes they simply sat. He taught her to read brands on cattle in a way that would prevent her being cheated at sale, which she had suspected was happening and now confirmed. She taught him the particular geography of her section of land in the way that only a person who has walked every inch of it knows, the places where the water table ran close to the surface, the places where the soil changed character and the grass grew different, the shortcut across the East Ridge that saved 40 minutes on the fence line patrol. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday evening in the second week of September, standing on the porch in the cooling air, and it was not a hasty or an uncertain thing. He had moved toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and she had not stepped back, and when his mouth found hers it was with a care that was its own kind of statement, the care of a man who understands that trust, once broken, is repaired with exceptional difficulty, and who is determined not to break what is being offered to him. She had kissed him back with the full force of everything she had been not letting herself feel for weeks, and when they finally stepped apart, both of them were slightly breathless, and he rested his forehead against hers and said nothing for a moment, just breathed, and she felt the warmth of him surrounding her in the mountain evening and thought, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she did not want to lose this. It was precisely then, as if the universe had a perverse sense of timing, that Cord Mackey arrived. He came in the night 2 days later, and Lenora did not know until morning, because Nathan handled it alone in the dark hours, and she found out what had happened because she heard raised voices in the yard at 4 in the morning, and came out with her late husband's rifle to find Nathan standing 12 feet from a man she had never seen, both of them very still. Cord Mackey was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something overtly menacing. What she saw instead was a man who looked ordinary, almost thin, with sandy hair and pale eyes that had the flat quality of someone for whom other people's safety was simply not a relevant consideration. He was smiling, which was worse than if he had not been. "Well," Mackey said when he saw her in the doorway with the rifle, "that's an interesting development." "Leave this property," Lenora said. She had the rifle leveled and her voice was completely steady, which surprised her. "I just want to have a conversation with Nathan about some money," Mackey said pleasantly. "I don't have your money, Cord," Nathan said. His voice was different in a way that she recognized as the particular quality of controlled anger that precedes violence. She had heard it from Carver, and she had learned to read it. On Carver, it had made her small and still. On Nathan, aimed at Mackey, it made her want to stand straighter. "We had a partnership," Mackey said. "We had a mistake," Nathan said. "One I have been correcting for 2 years. The money from Cimarron is gone and you know it. Dell spent it. I saw none of it and I owe you nothing." "Dell says different. Dell is a liar and you know he is a liar because you know everything he said to me that night and everything he promised me, and every one of those things was false," Nathan said. "I held your horses for 15 minutes out of stupidity and grief, and I have been paying for it every day since. You are not getting a single dollar from me, Cord. Not now and not ever. And if you ride onto this property again, you will deal with me and then you will deal with the federal marshal, because I will send word to Tanner Briggs myself and tell him exactly where to find you." Mackey looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Lenora. He looked at the rifle. "You've changed," Mackey said to Nathan, and his voice had shifted slightly, lost some of its pleasant surface. "Yes," Nathan said, "I have." Mackey looked at the homestead, at the land in the dark around it, at Lenora standing in the doorway. "Things that are precious can be lost," Mackey said, and the threat in it was so clear and so casual that it turned Lenora's stomach. "Cord," Nathan said, and his voice had dropped to something very quiet and very serious. "If you ever come near this woman or this property with harm in mind, I will find you. I promise you that, not a threat, a fact." There was a long silence. The mountain sat huge and dark against the sky behind Mackey's shoulder. An owl called somewhere to the east. Mackey stepped back toward his horse. He mounted without hurry. He looked at them both once more. "You were always too soft, Nathan," he said, and rode away into the dark. Lenora stood in the doorway until she could no longer hear the hoofbeats. Then she lowered the rifle and leaned against the door frame, and the shaking that she had been holding off finally arrived. Nathan crossed the yard to her in 3 strides and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her face. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I am going to be all right. Give me a moment." He gave her the moment, his hands steady on her shoulders, and when her breathing returned to normal she looked up at him. "He will not come back," Nathan said. "That is not me being certain about things I cannot know. That is me knowing Cord Mackey. He went after the low-risk target. I called his bluff and made it a higher risk. He will move on." "You cannot know that for certain," she said. "No," he admitted. "But I know it fairly well. And for what it is worth, I have not felt afraid of Cord Mackey for some time now. He held power over me because I had nothing to lose and nowhere to be, and running was easy. Those things are no longer true." She looked at him in the dark of the yard in the pre-dawn chill, and the look on his face was one she had been watching develop over weeks, a settling, a solidity, the look of a man who has found his footing in soil he trusts. She put her hand against his chest over his heart and felt it beating under her palm. "Good," she said. "Then we will deal with whatever comes next together." The hearing for the injunction was scheduled for the 3rd week of October, and the weeks between Mackey's nighttime visit and that date were ones in which Lenora found herself living at a level of emotional intensity she had not previously experienced, which was saying something, because her life had not been short on intensity. The love between them, because that was what it was by then, had moved from the careful and tentative into something fuller and more certain. He told her about Texas, and about his brothers, and about his mother, who had been a woman of great practicality and great warmth, and she heard in the way he described her the kind of loss that reorients everything about how a person moves through the world. She told him about Ohio and about her own family, about a father who had meant well and a mother who had been quietly brilliant, about the choices she had made at 24 that had brought her to 26 in Carver Leland, and a westward journey she had not planned. She told him about the relief she had felt at Carver's death, the shame of it, the way she had carried that shame privately for 3 years. He listened to that the way he listened to everything she told him fully, without flinching. "You felt relief because you were relieved," he said. "That was an honest feeling responding to an honest situation. Your husband was not kind to you. He put you in a trap through his own negligence and left you to escape it alone. The shame belongs to him, not to you." She had not expected to cry at that. She had thought herself past it. But something in the plain simplicity of his assessment, in the way it rearranged a story she had been telling herself for 3 years, opened something in her that had been sealed, and she cried against his shoulder in the kitchen that evening in a way that was not grief exactly, but more like the release of a long-carried weight. He held her without saying anything else, which was exactly right. They wrote to Hargrove together about the letters from Greer, the ones that predated the transaction and described the property as having clean title. Hargrove responded with a letter full of controlled but discernible legal excitement, stating that those letters were precisely the kind of evidence that could shift the outcome of the hearing substantially. Holt Greer received notice of the injunction and hearing. He responded with a letter to Lenora that was politely worded and cold-eyed, expressing confidence that the clause would be upheld, and suggesting that she would be wise to begin arranging her affairs for the eventuality of vacating the property. Lenora read the letter and folded it neatly and put it in the file she was keeping for Hargrove. She was not going anywhere. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in Pueblo on the 21st of October, 1884. Lenora sat at the plaintiff's table in her best dress, which was blue wool and had been pressed the night before with an iron heated on the stove, and Hargrove sat beside her with his yellow legal pads and his careful precision, and Nathan sat directly behind her in the gallery. She had been in rooms that felt hostile before. She had learned to hold herself in them as if the hostility was information rather than weather. Greer's attorney was a man named Fitch who was smooth and well-dressed, and had the air of someone who expected to win before the argument had started. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Hargrove presented the pre-transaction letters with a controlled, methodical precision that was beautiful in the way that very good, very careful thinking is beautiful. He walked the judge, a serious man named Raleigh whose reputation for fairness was something Hargrove had researched in advance, through the specific language of the clause, the specific language of Greer's earlier letters, and the specific legal question of whether a contract in which one party has been materially misrepresented about terms constitutes an enforceable agreement under Colorado territorial law. Fitch argued that the clause was standard, that it was signed, that Carver Leland was a grown man who should have obtained legal counsel before signing, and that Lenora Leland as his widow inherited both the property and the obligations therein. Judge Raleigh asked questions, sharp, precise questions that cut through the lawyerly language on both sides and got to the bone of the matter. At the end of 4 hours, he did not rule immediately. He stated that he would issue his written decision within 2 weeks, and that the injunction would remain in effect until that decision was rendered. He dismissed both parties with the economy of a man who has many more cases and very little time. Lenora walked out of the courthouse into the October afternoon and stood on the steps and breathed. Nathan was beside her. He said nothing. He simply stood there. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he agreed. She turned and looked at him. His face was unreadable, which was the face he wore in public, but his eyes were not, and she could see in them the same feeling she had, which was a taut, careful hope that was trying not to become something larger than the situation currently warranted. "Whatever happens," she said, "I want you to know that I am grateful you came to this property in June looking for work." His mouth curved. That slight, unhurried smile that she had come to understand was one of the rarest expressions in his repertoire, and therefore one of the most precious. "I am grateful too," he said. They rode back to Redstone Creek and they resumed the work of the land, but the 2 weeks of waiting had a particular texture to them, a heightened quality, every ordinary moment standing out in sharp relief. She would find herself in the middle of a common task, hanging laundry or checking the water trough or writing a letter, and she would be suddenly and completely aware of how much she wanted this land, this life, this particular arrangement of daily things that had become, over the course of a strange and difficult summer, something she could not imagine living without. She also was aware that the other question had not been addressed, the federal matter. They discussed it one evening on the porch, and it was a conversation she had been building toward for weeks. "You cannot drift forever," she said. "Briggs will not stop looking. The only way through this is through it." "I know," he said. "Hargrove handles criminal matters also," she said. "He told me so when we met him. I asked him, actually, while you were waiting." Nathan looked at her. A man who was present during a robbery but took no proceeds, immediately fled and separated himself from the perpetrators, and has since made continuing restitution payments, she said carefully, is not the same as a robber. "Hargrove told me he believes such a man could likely negotiate a resolution, particularly if he were to provide information regarding the location of the primary perpetrators." "You want me to give up Mackie," Nathan said. "I want you to give yourself a life that does not require constant movement," she said. "I want you to give yourself the possibility of standing still." The silence between them was long. The stars were extraordinary above the mountains. "Mackie was in Colorado last I knew," Nathan said slowly, moving toward Gunnison. "There are men he works with out of Gunnison." "Tell Hargrove," she said. "Tell him everything. Let him present it to the federal marshal's office in the proper way with proper representation. The goal is not vengeance. The goal is resolution." He looked at her for a long time. "You have thought about all of this," he said. "I have thought about very little else for 6 weeks," she said. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you doing this for me?" She looked at him steadily. "Because you are worth doing it for," she said simply, "and because I would like you to be able to stay." The pause after that was the kind that changes things. "Lenora," he said. "Don't," she said before he could say whatever careful, measured, self-protective thing he was preparing to say. "Don't tell me you cannot make promises. I told you I don't need promises. I need honesty, so be honest with me." He was quiet for a moment, and then, "I want to stay," he said. "I want to be here on this land with you. I want to help you build this into something solid. I want to stop running." He paused. "I have been running for 2 years from a mistake and also from something else. From the feeling that I did not deserve to stop, that a man who made the choices I made did not get to have something worth having." He looked at her. "I think that was wrong. I think that was a punishment I was inflicting on myself that nobody asked me to inflict, and that was helping nobody." "It was," she said. "I think," he said slowly, "that I want to be the kind of man who deserves what is on this table, even if I have not always been." "You are already that man," she said. "You have been working very hard at being that man for 2 years. I think it is time you accepted the position." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one. "The position of a man who has found where he belongs," she said. He reached across and took her hand and held it, and they sat like that in the night, not saying anything more because everything necessary had been said. The following week, they rode to Pueblo together again, and Nathan sat across from Hargrove in the attorney's small office and told him everything. every detail. Not just the outline, but the specifics, including what he knew of Mackey's movements, his contacts in Gunnison, the names of men Mackey had worked with, information that a federal marshal would find genuinely useful. Hargrove listened and wrote and asked questions, and at the end of the meeting he said that he believed he could negotiate a formal resolution, whereby Nathan would agree to testify against Mackey in exchange for immunity regarding the Cimarron incident, given the limited nature of his involvement and the subsequent restitution. The key, Hargrove said, is getting this to the right person at the federal level before Deputy Briggs makes any further moves that complicate the situation. I have a contact in the Denver federal office who I believe will be receptive to this approach. He looked at Nathan directly. You understand that this requires trust in the process, and that the process does not always go as hoped. I understand, Nathan said, and you are willing to proceed. Nathan looked at Lenora, who was sitting beside him, and she met his eyes, and the thing between them in that moment was something she thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The sight of him choosing to step towards something instead of away from it. Yes, he said, I am willing. Hargrove's letter to Denver went out that week. The decision from Judge Raleigh regarding the land came in the first week of November. She opened the letter at the kitchen table alone because Nathan was at the fence line, and she read it twice to make sure she was understanding correctly. The judge had ruled in her favor. The clause was found to be unenforceable on the grounds of material misrepresentation in the pre-transaction correspondence. The lien was vacated. The land was hers, cleanly and completely, with no encumbrance. Holt Greer's fraudulent scheme, at least regarding her property, was done. She sat at the table for a long time before she could move. She was aware of a feeling so large and complex that it had not fully resolved itself into any specific emotion, only a kind of overwhelming warmth that filled her from the inside, the knowledge that the thing she had fought for 3 years alone and these last months with Nathan, was hers. Then she got up from the table and walked across the yard and climbed the hill to the east fence where Nathan was working, and when he saw her face he stopped what he was doing and stood up straight. She held out the letter. He read it. His expression did not explode into anything. It did something quieter and more significant. It settled, like a stone finding the bottom of still water. He looked up at her. It is yours, he said. It is mine, she agreed. And then he crossed the space between them and kissed her with a thoroughness and a warmth that left her breathless and laughing at the same time. And she had not laughed like that in years, had not known that laughing and crying could happen simultaneously in response to joy until that moment. The Denver office responded to Hargrove's overture in late November, and the response was positive. A senior marshal whose name was Croft came to Pueblo in December to meet with Hargrove and Nathan, and Lenora sat in the waiting room of Hargrove's office while the meeting took place, her hands folded in her lap, her heart making itself known to her at an elevated rate. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When Nathan came out of Hargrove's office with Hargrove beside him, his face told her what she needed to know before either of them spoke. Hargrove said, Marshal Croft has agreed to the arrangement. Mr. Ralston's testimony regarding Cord Mackey and his associates will be provided in an official deposition. In exchange, the federal office will issue a formal nolle prosequi regarding Mr. Ralston's presence during the Cimarron incident, given the established facts of his limited involvement, his immediate departure from the perpetrators, and his consistent restitution payments. Lenora looked at Nathan. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before on him. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for so long that, when it is finally put down, the absence of it is almost disorienting. It is done, she asked. It is done, Hargrove said. She stood up from the chair, and Nathan was across the room, and she met him halfway, and he held her for a long moment in the middle of Hargrove's office, and Hargrove, to his very great credit, found something extremely interesting to look at out the window. Cord Mackey was apprehended by federal marshals the following February in Gunnison, Colorado, based substantially on the information Nathan had provided. Del Sutter was arrested in New Mexico Territory 2 months after that. Both men faced federal charges for the Cimarron robbery and several subsequent crimes that had accumulated in the intervening years. Nathan Ralston was no longer running from anything. The Christmas of 1884 was the first Christmas Lenora had spent in something approaching actual joy since she had been a child in Ohio. They were small in their celebration because they were not wealthy people, but they were not poor either, not anymore, with the land secured and a good season of cattle sales behind them. She had made a roast chicken and a dried apple cake, and they had sat at the kitchen table with a candle between them and eaten it together and talked until late in the evening about everything and nothing, and it had been, she thought, the best Christmas of her adult life by a substantial margin. In January, he asked her to marry him. He did not ask it with flourish. He asked it on a morning when they were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, which was where they seemed to have all their most important conversations, and he looked at her over his mug and said, "I would like to marry you, Lenora, if you are willing. I'm not saying that I deserve you, because I am honestly uncertain about that, but I am saying that I will spend whatever time we have together doing everything I can to be worthy of it." She put her mug down. She thought about everything that had happened since June. The work, the fear, the small daily moments that had built into a structure she could not imagine dismantling. The way he talked to her, the way he listened, the way he had walked into Hargrove's office and faced the hardest conversation of his life because she had told him it was time and he had believed her. The way he said her name, the way the land looked different now, fuller somehow, as if it had been waiting for two people on it instead of one. She thought about the breakfast table and the morning light and the dark eyes watching her steadily over the coffee mug and the words he had said, "I think I stopped being lost here," and how true she knew they were because she had watched him arrive and then watched him slowly stop. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." They were married in April of 1885 in the spring, when the land was greening and the mountains still had their winter caps and the whole country smelled of possibility. The ceremony was in Redstone Creek's small church, conducted by a minister named Pruitt, who was a brisk and cheerful man who clearly enjoyed the work of joining people together. The guests were few but real. Mrs. Farley, who had become a genuine friend over the previous years. Theo, who had managed the journey from Pueblo on his bad knees with the assistance of his sister. Hargrove, who attended with his wife and seemed genuinely pleased, and a handful of townspeople who had come to respect Lenora's tenacity and were willing to extend that respect to the man she had chosen. Nathan's brother, the one he still wrote to, a man named Joel Ralston who ran a small horse operation in West Texas, had sent a letter that arrived the week before the wedding, full of warmth and congratulations, and the news that he had been hoping for exactly this outcome for his brother for years. He could not make the journey in time, but he promised to visit before the summer was out. Lenora wore a dress she had made herself over the winter, cream-colored with blue stitching at the collar and cuffs, and she carried wildflowers from the hillside behind the homestead, purple and yellow ones, gathered that morning. Nathan wore his best shirt and had shaved and cut his hair, and when she saw him standing at the front of the church with his hands clasped and his dark eyes watching her come down the aisle, she felt the full force of everything she had survived to get to this moment. The words they said to each other were the traditional ones, and also some they had written themselves in the kitchen at that table over several evenings and many cups of coffee. His words to her were about honesty and presence, and the particular way that love, when it is real, does not ask you to be smaller than you are. Her words to him were about the courage it takes to stop running, and the way that home is not always a place you are born to, but sometimes a place you arrive at after a long and difficult journey and recognize on sight. There was not a dry eye in the small church, including, she noticed, Hargrove, who appeared to be examining his hat with great attention. They rode home to the homestead in the April afternoon, and the mountains were magnificent behind them, and the land was green in the way it was only green for this brief window each spring before the summer heat settled in, and Nathan reached across between the horses and took her hand as they rode, and held it, and the world felt like exactly the right size. The first year of their marriage was one of the most full and purposeful years Lenora had ever known. They worked the land together with a partnership that felt entirely equitable, dividing the work not by some fixed idea of what belonged to which of them, but by what needed doing and who was best positioned to do it. She had abilities he did not, and he had abilities she did not, and the combination of these was something considerably stronger than either alone. Joel Ralston came in July, as promised, and stayed for 3 weeks, and proved to be a man of great personal warmth and sharp humor, who treated Lenora from the first moment as a sister he was glad to have. He was shorter than Nathan and broader and had a laugh that could be heard across the yard, and he looked at the way his brother moved through the homestead and the land and shook his head and said, on a quiet evening on the porch, "I have not seen Nathan like this in a long time, not since before Texas, maybe not ever." He looked at Lenora. "You did something I was not sure anything could do." "He did it," she said. "I just gave him a reason to stay still long enough to do it." Joel shook his head again and smiled his loud smile and poured himself more coffee. The autumn of 1885 brought the news that Lenora had not expected but received with a joy that was entirely unambiguous. She was expecting a child. She told Nathan on a morning in October, at the kitchen table, over breakfast, which was, she thought, where all their most important things seemed to happen. The look on his face when she told him was something she knew she would carry for the rest of her life, the particular quality of a happiness so large and so unexpected that the body does not quite know how to contain it, and so it moves across the face in stages. He stood up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a moment and then said, "Lenora," and said nothing else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. Their son was born in June of 1886, a strong and healthy boy who arrived in the early morning hours with considerable noise and definite opinions, which Lenora took as an excellent sign. They named him Thomas Joel, the first name for her father, the second for Nathan's brother, who received the news via letter and wrote back immediately at a volume of exclamation that was clearly audible even in written form. Thomas was a child of the land from the beginning. He was placed on a horse for the first time at the age of 2, sitting in front of Nathan in the saddle, and he laughed with the pure delight of a child discovering something he already understands in his body, and Nathan held him with a careful attention that Lenora watched from the fence line with a feeling she could not fully name, some combination of love and gratitude and wonder that a life could bend this way, could turn from the shape of grief and struggle into this. The homestead grew. They added to the herd, carefully, over successive seasons, reinvesting each year's proceeds into the operation with the methodical patience of people building something they intend to last. They added a larger barn in the autumn of 1886, with Joel's help, who came again and proved himself as useful a builder as he was a talker. They dug a proper well in 1887, replacing the hand-carried water system that had been Lenora's original arrangement. Holt Greer attempted no further action against the property after Judge Raleigh's decision. He departed Red Stone Creek in early 1885 and was heard of subsequently in connection with land schemes in other parts of the territory, all of which Lenora tracked through the legal correspondence she continued with Hargrove, providing what information she could to assist other property owners who might be at risk of the same manipulations she had survived. She felt this was the right use of what she had learned, and the right use of having survived it. The federal case against Cord Mackey was resolved in 1886. He received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Del Sutter received 12. Nathan's cooperation had been formally acknowledged in the court record, and the matter was entirely closed. Nathan Ralston had no outstanding legal concerns of any kind. He was simply a man, on his land, with his family, with his name his own again. He told her about it on the evening the final letter from Hargrove arrived confirming the sentence. They were sitting on the porch in the summer evening, Thomas asleep inside after a day that had worn everyone out in the best possible way, and Nathan held the letter and read it and then set it on his knee and looked out at the valley. "It is really done," he said. "It has been done for some time," she said gently. "This is just the paper that says so." He looked at her. "I know," he said, "but there is something about the paper." "There is," she agreed. "Hargrove and his excellent papers." He smiled at that. The smile that she had spent 3 years watching become easier and more frequent, less guarded, less rationed. The smile of a man who has stopped expecting the world to punish him for it. "I have been thinking," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I have been thinking that Thomas will need more company," he said carefully. She looked at him sideways. "Is that so?" "It is a lot of land for one child to eventually inherit," he said, with an entirely straight face. "It is," she agreed solemnly. "And Joel says a working ranch runs better with more hands. Joel is probably right. And I," he said, looking at her now with that directness that she had learned to simply receive, because there was no deflecting it and no reason to, "would like more children, if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. "I have been waiting for you to mention it." He laughed properly, the way he laughed now that he had mostly stopped rationing that too. And she laughed with him in the summer evening above the valley, with the mountains behind them and Thomas asleep in the house they had built into a home, and the land stretching out in all directions belonging to them completely. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1888, and they named her Clara Me, the first name for no one in particular, but simply because it was a good name that suited her from the first moment, and the second for Lenora's mother. Clara came into the world with considerably more ceremony than Thomas had, a longer labor that left Lenora exhausted in a way she had not been before. But the moment the baby was placed in her arms, and she heard the first sound of the child's voice, everything else became irrelevant in the way that only the truly essential can make the merely important irrelevant. Nathan sat beside her that evening, Clara in the crook of his arm, Thomas asleep in his room, the house settling around them in the way of houses that are full of people who belong in them. And she looked at this scene and allowed herself to feel the full size of it. She thought about the girl she had been in Ohio, standing in a church making promises to a man she did not truly know, telling herself that love would come or that it did not matter or that this was simply the shape of a life. She thought about the journey west and the grief and the cruelty and the fear. She thought about the deed with the hidden clause and the $93 in the tin, and the letter from Greer suggesting she begin arranging her affairs. She thought about a gray horse appearing at the edge of her property line on a June morning in 1884, and a man on it with dark eyes and patient stillness and a dark past and an honest heart and the willingness, eventually, to stand still. She thought about a breakfast table and morning light, and the words that had changed everything. Nathan looked up and found her watching him, and his expression did what it always did under her direct attention, that small, unguarded softening that was entirely his and entirely hers. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about breakfast," she said. He tilted his head. "The morning you told me," she said, "that you thought you had stopped being lost here." He was quiet for a moment looking at her. "I had," he said. "I had stopped entirely." "I know," she said. "I could see it. That was the most frightening moment of that whole year for me, more frightening than Mackie, more frightening than Greer." "Why?" "Because I wanted it to be true," she said. "And I had not wanted anything to be true in a very long time. And wanting something to be true is the most dangerous thing." He looked at her for a long moment, Clara's small warmth between them, the house quiet and full. "Was it worth the danger?" he asked. She looked at him, at the face she had watched harden and soften and open over the years since that morning, at the man who had shown up as a stranger with a dark past and no anchor and had become, through the slow and necessary work of honesty and courage and choosing not to run, the most present and solid and real thing in her life. Every bit of it, she said. He reached across and took her hand, careful not to disturb Clara, and held it the way he had always held it, with the particular care of someone who understands the value of what they are holding. Outside, the Colorado night was enormous and clear, the stars coming out above the mountains in their thousands, the land stretching away in every direction as far as anyone could see. The cattle were settled. The horses were in the barn. Thomas was asleep dreaming whatever particular and magnificent dreams a 2-year-old boy dreams when the day has been full and good. The homestead was quiet in the way of full houses in the late evening, the kind of quiet that is not absence but presence, the presence of a life built with care and honesty, and the willingness to stop and be found. Nathan Ralston had arrived on this land as a drifter with a dark past and a borrowed name and nowhere to be. He had arrived dusty and watchful and carrying the particular loneliness of a man who has been moving so long he has forgotten what stillness feels like. He had arrived prepared to stay only as long as needed and move on before anything could root him. He had underestimated the land. He had underestimated the woman. He had underestimated himself. Lenora looked at her husband and her daughter and thought about the years still ahead of them, the years of work and seasons and ordinary mornings at this table, of Thomas growing into the land and Clara growing up in the mountain's shadow, of cattle and fences, and the particular daily rhythm that was theirs alone. She thought about growing older beside this man, who had come to her already shaped by difficulty, and was better for it, honest in the way that only someone who has faced their own failure and kept going can be honest. She thought about the mornings to come, the coffee on the table, the light coming through the window, the two of them sitting across from each other in the ordinary, extraordinary way of people who have chosen well and know it. She was not afraid of any of it. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, on her land in her life, beside the man who had arrived lost and found himself home, and she had never, not once in the difficult years behind her, imagined that the future could feel like this, like something worth everything it had cost to reach, like home, like the truest, most uncomplicated, most complete version of what the word love could possibly mean when everything else had been stripped away and only the essential remained. Nathan looked down at Clara and then up at her and smiled. And the mountain stood outside the window in the dark, unchanged, enormous, patient, holding the valley and the homestead and the small bright lights of their life together in the way that the land holds everything, without condition, without end.